A lamp burns through the night in a stone chamber, its small flame guarding a secret that no wall can keep out, footsteps that never echo, a blade that never clatters, a promise delivered in silence. Princes post sentries, viziers sleep in armor, yet rumors move faster than couriers. They whisper about mountaineers and men who step from crowds as if born from smoke. Some call them assassins, others the Nizari. Both names carry gravity, but only one points to people who actually lived, prayed, trained. Before we wander into legend, let's anchor ourselves. We are in the 11th and 12th centuries, across Persia and Syria, where the Nizari Ismailis hold fastnesses stitched into cliffs. Their most fabled stronghold is Alamat, the Eagle's Nest, a fortress that supervises the valleys like a patient hawk. In Syria, Masyaf keeps watch over roads and rivalries. From these high places, messages ride with the wind. From these high places, commands sink quietly into cities. The Nizari network is not counter. The word assassin will chase us, but we will not let it lead. Chroniclers who feared or hated the Nizari invented colorful stories to explain their daring. You will hear of secret gardens and enchanted wine, of youths lulled into loyalty by illusions. You will hear of hashish, of trance, of obedience stronger than breath. These tales travel well because they flatter the listener with a taste of forbidden knowledge. Yet the record offers a plainer, more unsettling picture. Disciplined agents who moved, who organized this. At the center stands Wazen, a strategist with a scholar's patience and a conspirator's reach. He did not command armies that could win fields. He cultivated a web that could alter decisions. He did not promise immortality in pleasure gardens. He promised purpose, order, and a creed sharpened by danger. In his hands, the Fidaji, one who sacrifices himself, was less a fanatic than a specialist. Reconnaissance, disguise, proximity, a swift exit if possible, a dignified death if n. But we are telling a sleep story, and sleep asks for steadiness, so let the noise fade. Picture a courtyard at dawn, wet stone underfoot, a young agent tying his sash with practiced calm. He knows the name he must approach, the alley he must cross, the hour when the gate is less watched. He has rehearsed the motions so well that fear has nowhere to live. Around him, a small community keeps life ordinary. Bread is baked, a teacher unrolls a text, a guard adjusts a lampwick. The mission is an interruption. The Nizari did not live as shadows. They farmed terraces, stored grain, and maintained libraries. Letters traveled with merchants and pilgrims. Diplomacy mattered as much as blades. A threat placed on a pillow could spare a life by clarifying the cost of stubbornness. A ceasefire could be bought with a gesture, an ambassador welcomed, a hostage returned, a rumor buried. Yet even peace was tactical, a rest step on a long ascent. Every bargain turned on credibility, and credibility was built with deeds. We will test favorite stories against steadier sources as we go. We will watch the theater that formed around the Nizari name, and we will measure it against what clerks, envoys, and enemies wrote when ink was cheap and sleep was rare. For now, hold 3 threads. First, a network small enough to be nimble. Second, fortresses that turned mountains into messages. Third, a style of violence that spoke in complete sentences. Keep the lamp lit. Our first case arrives on soft feet and leaves hard questions. A scholar-statesman meets a man in a crowded space. A sleeve shifts, a blade appears, a dynasty trembles, and the legend takes a breath. Names weigh on stories. Enemies spat hash-kushin, perhaps to paint them as drug-medicine. Tellers repeated it until it hardened into assassin. Others prefer Ast-Sion, people of principle. Either way, the nickname became a mask, turning careful operators into phantoms. Tradecraft thrives where armies store. The dagger, not the siege tower, solves certain problems. No supply lines, no banners to betray intent, no trumpets to wake a city. One appearance in a festival crowd could rebalance a treaty. This was policy by the chamber cools, hooves ring on stone. A messenger waits with a name and a time. Our path bends toward a Seljuk tent and a scholar-statesman who kept empires orderly with ink. He is about to meet a visitor he did not invite. The street will be crowded the instant brief, the consequence echoing for many years. A scholar-statesman enters the morning like he always does, with neat margins in his mind. Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier of the Seljuks, prefers order-sealed packets, clean briefs, a line of envoys waiting at the tent flap. Markets hum outside. Inside, the air is ink and leather. Somewhere between 2 signatures, A stranger approaches. There is no raised voice, no trumpet, only the small gravity of someone who means to stand very close. A sleeve shifts, a blade slides. For a heartbeat, the year is 1092, the court of Maliksha. Sources disagree about details, but the shock is consistent. The steward of a realm lies struck in a public moment. Was the killer Nizari? Several chronicles say so. Others treat the claim as rumor shaped by fear. The vizier had enemies far beyond al-Mulk, courtiers, rivals, men who prefer chaos because they profit from sorting it later. We will not pretend certainty. We will hold the knife in an open palm and describe what it seems to cut. Tradecraft explains the setting. Crowds make witnesses. Witnesses make messages. A dagger in daylight says more than a night arrow in an empty street. The target was protected by protocol, not by walls. Proximity defeats protocol. The attacker uses a simple disguise and a practiced calm. He does not need to flee far. Panic carries him like a current. If seized, he accepts capture with composed silence, because the performance does not end after the strike. It ends when the story settles in the minds of T. Why would the Nizari risk this? Not for numbers, for leverage. A single public blow on 3 months of treaties. The Seljuk machine depends on trust in routine. Remove the man who oils the cogs and the wheel squeals. Governors hesitate. Emissaries stall. Suspicion hardens around the edges of every decision. From a mountain fastness, one sends no battalion, only a possibility. It arrives wearing cotton and leaves wearing legend. Now lift the tent flap. The court trembles. Malik Shah must show control. Orders fly. Names are written in darker ink. Some men advise harsh reprisals. Others recommend patient inquiry. The vizier's ledgers now sit like votive lamps around the chamber, warm with numbers that cannot counsel back. In this confusion, rumor thrives. The assassin's identity is told and retold. A particular name sticks. Fida listeners nod as if they always expected a shadow from those far terraces. Yet another thread pulls at the weave succession. The same year will bring the Sultan's own death, sudden and disruptive. Factions already whisper for enemies of the Nizari. It is convenient to braid every trouble into one rope and label it with a mountain's name. For the Nizari, it is convenient to let enemies do that work. Fear outsources propaganda. Even if the killer was not theirs, the echo serves them. Consider the human scale. A clerk who copied edicts yesterday now watches guards argue over who stands closest to the new minister. A courier hesitates at a city gate longer than usual. A provincial judge deletes a sentence from a verdict because it might sound like a side in a private war. None of these acts bear a dagger's flash. All of them are its long shadow. This is why proximity operations mattered. They rearranged emotional furniture. We leave the vizier to his silence and follow the echo into Syria, where Saladin will learn just how gently a fortress can move a valley. 2 attempts will test his vigilance and his patience. Siege engines will face something quieter than stone and more stubborn than timber. Reputation, and in the coarse weave of campaign life, a rumor will be stitched of a ruler who woke to find a gift by his bed, with writing that cut deeper than steel. Hold that image like a bookmark. Before we open it, step into Mashiaf at dusk. The air is time and dust. Lamps bead the walls like constellations. A gate grinds shut. On a parapet, a watchman leans into the breeze that carries many languages. Behind him, a small school recites in even tones. In a cellar, someone sharpens a blade and then carefully wraps it away. Not for frenzy, for focus, for timing, for a moment that changes the slope of a campaign without spilling a river of blood. Our path bends again. Horses stamp. A commander writes a list of trusted names and still sleeps badly. Somewhere beyond the campfires, a figure rehearses 6 steps, 3 turns, 1 breath. In the morning there will be confusion, boasts, denials, and negotiations. Tonight there is only practice, and a promise that the quietest act can be the loudest answer. Stories will embroider themselves. Some will swear that a dagger and a note once greeted a sleeping general, the lamp haloing the warning like a crown. Others will insist it was camp gossip inflated by fear. We will weigh both with a steady hand, but the effect is not debated. Guards count shadows, tents feel thinner than paper. Saladin rides with the long patience of a man who has outlived many sieges. In his camp the rhythms are simple: prayer, dispatches, a measured meal, the slow thrum of scouts passing in and out like tide. He knows the Syrian hills are studded with small teeth of stone, and one of those teeth bears a name that soldiers speak with a tilt of respect. Monsieur. There, Rashid Aldenson keeps a ledger not of taxes but of possibilities. 2 times, say the chroniclers, blades came near Saladin. 2 times, the hand that held them did not finish what it began. The hills remember both. The first attempt rises from dust and confusion near Aleppo. Camp followers swear they saw a stranger dressed like a familiar man, moving as if the path had been walked many times. A jostle, a reach, a flash by the stirrup, and then the assault breaks on armor and reflex. The attacker falls. The camp hardens. Saladin answers with discipline. He thickens his guard, narrows his audience, and sends word to cities that thought themselves spectators that they are now part of the stage. The second attempt at Auzes smells the same of closeness and risk. Again, the strike fails, but the message does not. Siege follows anger the way thunder follows lightning. Saladin marches to Masyaf to press the high walls and the higher will behind them. Engines groan, ropes sing, stones trace heavy arcs into the mountain's breath. Then the stalemate that fortresses love begins to grind its quiet gears. Nights lengthen. Scouts report more questions than answers. Men grow sharper at the edges. Stories bloom because boredom waters them. And one story, green and quick, climbs every tent pole. A dagger placed by the Sultan's bed with a note that reads like a whisper turned into writing. Did it happen? We hold the tale with 2 fingers. Some sources pass it along as if they saw the lamplight shine on steel. Others treat it as campaign theater. Yet even doubts can be useful. The rumor makes a point the stones cannot. You are not besieging a wall. You are bargaining with a network that can skip your lines, greet you in your own tent, and depart without creasing the pillow. Under that idea, the siege air thins. The general who trusts cavalry now measures footfalls. The guard who watched horizons now counts the shadows piled near the ropes. What allows such confidence? Masyaf is not only a gate and a keep, it is a school of timing. Messengers ride to distant towns with soft threats that save lives by preventing the need to take them. A rival emir receives a letter whose folded corners smell faintly of cedar and argument. A market preacher changes his topic for 1 week, and a city changes its temperature for 1 month. Meanwhile, fetus learn patience 1 errand at a time. Months inside a target city, a borrowed trade, a name that fits like a well-used tool, a presence so ordinary that it becomes a cloak. Saladin was no fool. He answered reputation with reputation. He made display a tactic open out in fears under heavier watch. Generous alms to show that fear had not made him smaller. Swift punishments to prove he was not distracted. He sent envoys to test whether the mountain wanted terms more than bruises. Some say a truce was struck, brief and pragmatic, stitched from mutual respect and fatigue. Others insist the siege simply ran its course, as mountains do. Either way, the campaign bent toward other urgencies, leaving Masyaf standing and the lesson standing taller. When the army moved on, the lesson did not. Courts across Syria adjusted their furniture. Princes counted not only spears but also doors and habits. Trusted attendants were rotated. New passwords were chosen, then changed again before they had time to grow comfortable. A ruler who once sat in a pavilion now chose a stone room with fewer seams. Bodyguards learned to guard inward as carefully as outward. In this way, even failed attempts achieved their work. They wrote in the margins of power, and the margins bled into the text. Set the rumor aside for a moment and watch craft at ground level. A Fida studies a procession for a week, learns the rhythm of a popular chant so his lips can move with the crowd, learns a vendor's grin so a guard reads cheer instead of focus. He rehearses the weight shift that lets a hidden dagger clear cloth without snagging. He memorizes the nearest fountain, the nearest alley, the 3 faces most likely to doubt him, and the one most likely to believe whatever he says. None of this touches myth. All of it touches outcomes. From these nights and near misses grows a map of influence. The Nizari cannot take Cairo or Damascus. They can make Cairo and Damascus breathe a little shorter. They cannot redraw borders. They can postpone them. And because they act inside a tension rather than atop terrain, their successes are often invisible, contained in decisions that are never made, journeys that are never taken, boasts that die before they reach a mouth. Our road leaves the Sultan's tent and follows a quieter thread toward the coast. In the city of Tyre, a prince will walk home beneath lamps that hiss over cool streets. He has enemies dense as a net, friends thin as a strand. Two men will approach with a gift shaped like respect. The blow that follows will tilt a crusade and teach Europe a new way to speak the Nizari name. His name is Conrad of Montferrat. The knight leans in to hear his final step now. Tyre breathes like a harbor at Restropes Creek. Lamps hiss, and salt hangs in doorways. Conrad of Montferrat has made this city a hinge between hope and siege. He walks with the confidence of a man who has pushed back doom before. Courtiers peel away, shopkeepers bow, and two quiet figures remain. Faces framed by hoods that mark them as men of prayer or message. Respect is a weapon in polite shape. They bow deeper than courtiers do. Conrad inclines his head. The moment is a cup that suddenly spills. The blades appear almost tenderly, as if revealing a vow rather than breaking peace. One stroke then another, trained for organs rather than theater. Witnesses shout. The attackers do not flee in panic. They cling to the plan. One is cut down. The other is seized and will. Some say, speak before he dies. It is April 1192, and the crusade now carries a new wound that no poultice saves. Conrad falls where he has stood so often, in a city whose stones learned his step. Why him? He was days from being crowned king of Jerusalem in name if not in geography. He had offended and impressed in equal measure, bargaining for Tyre's survival and making enemies who counted their pride as treasure. The Nizari choice of target performs politics. Strike the pivot and you tilt the board. Yet who ordered it remains a hall of mirrors. At some point at Saladin remove a stubborn foe without opening another front. Others point at Richard of England. Conrad had resisted Richard's plans and, let's separate the certain from the dramatic. Certain two killers approached in the dress of men who would not be searched. Certain Conrad died swiftly. Certain one assassin was captured and reportedly confessed to having been sent by the Syrian Nizari, the dramatic, which patron commissioned the deed. Letters flew across the sea, arguments nested in arguments, and each side found a motive that fit neatly into its own grievances. The truth may be plain and unreachable, like a coin at the bottom of a sea. What does the method tell us? Disguise is trust. Timing is punctuation. Location is message. The strike took place not in a battlefield but in the lanes of authority, where every step is witnessed by rumor. This is classic FIDA grammar. Step close under a banner of respect. Write the outcome with steel, then let politics do the copying. The aftershocks matter as much as the moment. In the days that followed, councils met in fast whispers. Guards doubled their inner rings. Ambassadors reviewed gifts wit. European memory learned a new pronunciation that night. Assassin was no longer only a distant terror from Persian ridges. It was now a doorway, a market, a prince on a stone street. The variety itself is part of the tactic. A technique that thrives on proximity also thrives on ambiguity. Because doubt is a second blade that continues cutting after the first has been sheathed. Conrad's death altered alignments. Richard's camp defended its honor with noise and paper. Saladin's envoys found new leverage and new caution. Henry of Champagne assumed a role that conspiracy would never stop auditing. Church porches learned a sterner scrutiny. The stagecraft of safety improved, but the stage itself remained public, and that is where such stories prefer to stand. Set Tyre aside for a moment and look back inland, where the mountains kept their own calendar. Alamut would fall to the Mongols decades later, but in our path tonight, the Nizari remain an agile force in Syria. Their influence survives in habits even as castles crack elsewhere. The craft moves with people, not just with walls. And so, years after Conrad's street darkened, another episode near the sea engraves itself on English memory. A prince in Acre, a friendly visit, a hidden blade, a fever of stories. Prince Edward later, Edward I receives a man who seems devoted, perhaps even a convert bearing gifts. The greeting curves into violence. A small blade, a sudden wound, and a panic that ties itself into legend. Was the dagger smeared with poison? Some say yes, weaving fever and rescue into a knightly romance. Others call it an invention layered on a very real attack. The prince lives, but the tale spreads like a banner, even inside a guarded lodging. Danger can make a polite bow and ask to come in. Noticed a repeating lesson. The theater is intimate. A handshake, a gift, a letter, a blessing. These are the costumes of peril. Armies threaten borders, fides threaten habits, and habits are where rulers sleep. What comes next is not louder but slower. A look inside the strongholds themselves. How did communities that could produce such poise also tend vineyards, copybooks, and build channels that carried snowmelt to terrace fields? To answer, we climb a narrow path, trace a watercourse by lantern, and open a door into a library that heard the Mongols at its threshold and still taught a morning class. The blade in the book lived closer than legend admits. In such rooms, whispers travel farther than hooves. A single rumor can move maps faster than a regiment can. We climb now slowly. The path to a Nizari fortress teaches patience before it teaches fear. Steps shorten as the slope winds, air cools. The valley loosens its grip. At a turn in the rock, a low door swallows you, and the mountain begins to speak in corridors. Alamet was not only a cliff crowned with stone. It was a solved problem in logistics. Snowmelt learned manners there. Channels cut into the shoulder of the ridge carried water toward terraces that kept their green even when the lowlands browned. Cisterns held ... inside. The work of survival looked ordinary and therefore profound. Grain bins lined with plaster, vats for dye and vinegar. A small forge where a patient smith made hinges and mended tools before he mended men. In one chamber, scribes bent over paper rubbed smooth with pumice, copying law, philosophy, poetry, letters, and receipts. Knowledge shared a table with bookkeeping because both governed risk. A library is a kind of arsenal that fights forgetfulness. The fame later chroniclers gave to gardens of young students learned to read a line, to breathe between clauses, to hold debate without heat. Older students learned geography with their feet. A boy might spend 3 months in a friendly town learning a craft that would become camouflage. Another might carry sealed notes to a rival emir and return with a promise that never makes a speech. In the evenings, teachers tested memory not with recitation alone but with questions about roads, market days, and the price of oil after a siege. Intelligence begged, discipline kept the home quiet. The guard schedule was a rope with many knots. If one hand slipped, another held. When visitors arrived, hospitality was careful, not cold. Bread, salt, and a conversation measured like a chess opening. Few saw the innermost holes. Fewer still knew how many exits a single stairwell could hide. The goal was not paranoia for its own sake. It was resilience. A place that survives by precision must distribute that precision until it becomes habit. Habits mean that emergencies. From time to time, envoys from princes or crusader lords climbed the same path you were imagining. Negotiations at altitude have a different temperature. Words cool before they reach the ear. Rashid al-Din in Syria and governors in Persia understood the advantage of letting guests witness austerity without spectacle. No peacock displays, no banners curtained over fear, just granaries, steady water, disciplined rooms, and the implication that a network this careful could be a useful neighbor. And yet, mountains cannot outstare empires forever. When the Mongol tide rolled west, even stubborn ridges learned humility. Hulug's armies taught stone to bow. The fall of Alamet in the mid-13th century did not erase the practices that had made it matter, it scattered them. Families carried memory downhill like coals in a pot. Techniques of message and disguise, of patience and proportion, traveled with them into towns and valleys where a fortress could be a rented room and a community could be 3. Life inside was not joyless. Weddings braided the practical with the bright. Musicians were frugal with volume but generous with rhythm. A child's laughter once startled a sentry into smiling at his own seriousness. Gardens worked hard, but they also rested the eye. The same terraces that fed the fortress instructed its mood. Vertical patience, horizontal grace. Evening lamps stitched the courtyards into constellations. If you stood at the highest parapet, you could watch the valley's night fires answer ... In such places, a feeder trained in more than courage. He trained in courtesy, because courtesy opens doors that courage should not have to break. He trained in silence, because silence wastes no strength. He trained in exit as much as entry. The blade mattered less than the mind that could put it away when a letter would do, or leave it sheathed when a rumor could save 3 lives. The fortress taught restraint as a technology. Imagine the last night before departure. A small pack lies ready, a change of clothes, a cord, a waxed packet, a short blade wrapped in linen, a sprig of dried herb to anchor the scent of home. A mentor checks each item without comment. The farewell is brief because long goodbyes tangle the will. The gate opens like a held breath released. The mountain lets go of another careful hope and waits to hear from it in the turning of a season. Our path will follow one of those hopes across a crowded market, into a palace corridor, and through a decision that would not exist without weeks of patience behind it. But before we step back into the streets, we pause at a table where elders examine words themselves. They argue gently about names, about whether the insult Hashukshin ever named them truly, about whether a Saiyan people of principle better fits the spine of their practice. Outside, wind pulls at the banners. Inside, ink dries, rumors last, names travel faster than armies, and sometimes they return wearing costumes we never gave them. Assassin, the word that clings like burrs to the Nizari, blooms from hostile mouths. Enemies spat Hashukshin and drug takers as a smear. Later tellers savored the flavor and served it as fact. Others, defending the mountain, preferred Ast-Sion people of principle as a counter-etching on the same coin. Between insult and ideal, the craft itself keeps its own counsel. No chronicler's syllable ever opened a gate. Enter the figure that Europe loves to fear, the old man of the mountain. He appears in travelogues as a conductor of illusions, a ringmaster of paradise gardens where youths were lulled, dazzled, and sent out like arrows drunk on promise. It is a tale built to be retold by firesides. But when you sift testimony, the glitter thins. You find rival propagandists, second-hand marvels, and the useful fog that campaigns exhale. The Nizari did not need sorcery to place a blade within arm's length. They needed LA... Myth survives because it flatters. If an enemy must be explained, make him magical. Then his rare successes can be quarantined in wonder instead of studied for instruction. Reality is humbler and more frightening. Apprenticeships, passwords, routes that change with seasons, couriers who can forget a message under pressure and remember it when the moment is right. A creed that teaches proportion. Do only as much harm as earns the result, then stop. It is policy as carpentry measured twice, cut once. Santee. Listen for what the sources agree on. Proximity, discipline, and theater used sparingly but with perfect aim. Daggers more often than poison. Crowds more often than rooftops. Daylight more often than midnight. The point was not gore, it was grammar. An act should read cleanly from 50 paces and from 50 years later. Even hostile writers admit the poise. Their anger can't quite hide their reluctant respect. Countermeasures evolved like reflexes. Rulers learned to rotate guards between inner and outer rings. Two separate sleepers from petitioners, to break up routines that make perfect maps. They harden thresholds with ritual. Kiss the hand here, kneel there, pause exactly this long under these watches. Every added movement becomes a filter. Some hired foreign guards whose loyalties braided differently from palace factions, and some shifted councils from pavilions to stone rooms whose seams could be counted. Beyond the blade, letters work like gravity. A courier arrives with a soft warning. Change a policy, return a hostage, reconsider a siege. The most economical victory is a decision the opponent makes himself. Gifts traveled 2 dates cloth, a falcon tokens that carried the possibility of future peace or the suggestion of its price. The craft prized outcomes, not drama. A spared life could advertise strength better than a square painted red. Alliances knitted across creed when interest aligned. There were truces with Crusader lords and understandings with Sunni rulers when both sides preferred a local equilibrium to a large gamble. The Nizari were not a storm. They were weather capable of clearing or hazing a day. Their flexibility kept them alive in tight valleys where empires trampled one another's banners to rags. Now and then, theater served a knife left under a cushion, a message pinned with a needle to a tent pole, a rumor seeded with the exact detail that makes it bloom in the listener's mind. But theater without follow-through dissolves. What sustained the legend was the ledger. Successes audited, failures examined without vanity, procedures revised like a craft guild's handbook. Someone counted footsteps. Someone drew new routes on scrap parchment. Someone taught a younger hand how to tie a sash so it never stepped back and quiet the room. Picture a master and an apprentice with a candle between them. They speak about exits, not just entries. About when to wait and when to write instead. About how a face should rest in crowds alert but unfocused, ready but uninteresting. The candle gutters. The lesson ends with an instruction that sounds like prayer. Leave no story behind you that your purpose does not need. From here, our path turns outward again, toward the courts that learn to live under that quiet pressure. We will watch negotiations that looked like peace but were really accounting. We will watch reprisals that looked like strength but were actually fear and armor. At the horizon the Mongol dust gathers. Valleys that once echoed with saddle bells will hear a different thunder, and the high libraries will have to choose what to save first, grain, paper, or the habit of composure. When that thunder arrives, stone will not argue long. Alamat will bow, Masyaf will bargain, and people will do what mountains cannot, move, and carry craft and habits. Dust rose on horizons like cautions written in the sky. The Mongols did not negotiate with walls. They taught walls to kneel. Hulog's army advanced with engineers who treated rock like wet clay, with archers who turned courtyards into storms, with administrators who could turn a surrender into an account book before noon. In that pressure, even fortresses built on thrift felt the math shift. Alamat had reservoirs, granaries, and resolve. It did not have a counter-argument to trebuchets that threw houses. The campaign that unseated the Persian strongholds did not erase the Nizari, it scattered them. Communities stepped off ridges and folded themselves into towns, caravanserais gardens along riverbanks. Knowledge went light. Passwords memorized instead of written. Faces that held to names. Skills that were ordinary on the surface and exact beneath. A feeder could be a dyer, a mason, a spice clerk measuring out promise with cumin. The network learned to survive without a skyline. It learned to be portable. Records of the fall are colored by victors and by survivors. Some speak of libraries burned to an ash that smelled of glue and ink. Others speak of volumes rescued, relocated, recopied. Either way, the habit of carefulness endured. You can take stone. It is harder to take proportion. The ledger survived in memory. What enters a city, what leaves, which doors open late, which markets teach you more than sermons. Even after the banners changed, the practice of reading places like texts kept writing results. In Syria, the script did not collapse so quickly. Masyaf negotiated, yielded, and endured. Power bent like a reed in flood and then straightened. The craft adapted to new neighbors, new governors, new ambitions that passed through like weather. Crusader lords came and went. Mamluks pressed and patrolled. Merchants kept adding up columns. In that turning of pages, the Nizari learned to act under brighter scrutiny. Operations thinned, became rarer, became needles, not cloth. Influence persisted in the pores. What, then, of Europe's memory? Still warm from Tyre, it found another ember at Acre. Prince Edward met a visitor whose devotion hid a blade. The wound fed a story that grew taller with each retelling. Some said the knife was smeared with poison. Some said the fever was a camp disease given a melodramatic mask. Some framed a rescue that reads like a romance meant to flatter courage. What remains solid is small: the visitor, the stab, the alarm, the prince's survival. The rest is wallpaper pasted over shock. Consider how a tale like that travels. It flatters vigilance. It warns that trust is a door you must never leave on the latch. It offers the pleasant fear of thinking you, too, might have the poise to catch a wrist at the last second. It also confirms a lesson the Nizari wanted opponents to keep. Your tent is not safe because it is yours. Safety is a sequence of habits that can be rehearsed or neglected. Miss a step, and a stranger finishes your sentence for you. From these collapses and near misses, a pair of truths emerge. First, reputation is a currency that buys time. A threatened ruler might choose treaty over rage if he believes the dagger can reach him faster than his army can reach a mountain. Second, discretion scales better than spectacle. A fortress can fall once. A method of thinking can move into 10,000 rooms. After Alamat, the method traveled Antweight, grain sack, silent, packed in customs, prayers, and the way a messenger not string. Meanwhile, opponents professionalized their caution. They mapped audiences as if they were battlefields. They standardized greetings, checkpoints, the choreography of approach. They rewarded servants who questioned politely, and rotated tasks before familiarity bred holes. Chroniclers noticed the change and complained that courts had grown stiff. They had not. They had grown exact. The price of a prince's breath was a little friction at every threshold. We pause here, on a ridge between ages. Behind us, libraries in smoke and stone. Ahead, a vocabulary that will outlive the people who inspired it. Assassin will become a word that painters borrow, that novelists stretch, that games dress in leather. It will drift from the Nizari to any killer who works at arm's length, and then to any rumor that claims cleverness with a knife. The more it travels, the less it remembers. Our work tonight is to remember for it, to keep the blade near the ledger. The road bends again toward everyday rooms, kitchens where decisions begin, chancelleries where names are weighed, small mosques and chapels where counsel sounds like prayer. In those rooms, the perilous life we are tracing becomes an ordinary discipline, patience, proportion, and a steady refusal to be loud unless loudness serves. We will follow that thread through letters that ended sieges, through truces that hid his market days, and through one meeting where a soft gift prevented a hard decade. In a small chancery that smells of wax and rushes, a scribe warms his hands and copies a letter so short it could hide under a ring. The seal will matter more than the sentence. It reads like an elbow on a pressure point. Return the hostage and the market will reopen. Keep him and your knights will shiver. No curses, no boasts, only a promise wrapped in politeness. At the gate he will ask for bread first, not from hunger but because custom is a key that turns doors. Across the city, a ruler debates in a room that measures power by rugs. His treasurer lists costs off the map, salaries for new guards, sleeplessness on judgment, the way merchants migrate when fear raises taxes without a law. The ruler touches the seal with his thumb and finds it heavier than the ring that pressed it. He imagines a corridor, an alcove, a sleeve, and understands that the cheaper choice looks like mercy. The hostage returns to his family. The city breathes, the way a tightened fist slowly unclenches. Truces, dressed as market days, dotted the 13th century like dew. A caravan's schedule changed by a week, and a feud cooled by a month. A governor's nephew was hired by a rival on purpose, and suddenly 2 hot stones sat in the same water. In some towns the Friday sermon softened 3 phrases, and the city's temperature fell 2 degrees. These are the measurements that never reached chronicles hungry for clangor, yet they carried the craft into daily life. A blade is a syllable, a truce is grammar. Inside the communities that practiced this grammar, oaths were made with care. New recruits were not promised paradise, they were promised work that would challenge breath and mind. A senior taught a junior how to disappear without moving, how to be amiable without inviting, how to be helpful without becoming known. They drilled exits first, then entries, because survival is a loop, not a line. They rehearsed humility, the best camouflage in any crowded street. The creed did not ask for noise, it asked for proportion. Recruitment flowed through kinship, trade, and study. A young mason who could lay stone plumb could also memorize a procession's rhythm. A clerk who could balance ledgers could also adjust an alias when a name began to shine suspiciously. The work selected temperaments that preferred patience to fireworks. Reckless men were encouraged toward other callings. It was a labor of making fewer enemies than you had to, and of choosing the time when one more enemy would be the right number. Counterintelligence mirrored these habits in palaces and camps. Guards learned to greet without announcing suspicion, to let the polite question be a wall. Kitchen zoes gossip engines became early warning systems. A new face that did not know where the pepper was kept Drew notice faster than a crossbow on a roof. Servants were rotated between duties so that routine could not be mapped by an attentive stranger. The best protection looked like good housekeeping. The worst lapse looked like pride in being predictable. One recorded exchange shows the method without blood. A provincial emir prepared to crush a village he accused of aiding foes. A letter arrived the night before, quiet as frost. It reminded him that he had 2 sons traveling to the coast with a small escort, that the road after the 3rd bridge had an inn with a crooked lintel, that mercy purchased a cheaper reputation than vengeance. The emir woke different. He taxed the village, posted a notice about order, and moved his anger 1 valley over where it could do less harm. For all the economy of the craft, danger remained its constant partner. A Fida could invest 3 years inside a court and lose everything to an accident of weather or a novice guard. Lucky suspicion. He kept his pack small, his posture natural, his stories simple enough to survive a blunt question at dawn. If captured, he preferred silence. If he spoke, it was to misdirect without melodrama. Legends paint frenzy. Practice preferred cool wrists and a tidy room. In European ports, the name that once belonged to mountain folk began to slide free of its anchor. Any knife at close range, any plot with patience, any rumor about hidden schools became assassin work. Minstrels trimmed history to fit a refrain. The chastened truths about letters, oaths, and the arithmetic of harm was less simple. Still, in archives and legal notes you can find the edges of reality, fines adjusted after a scare, Tolls remitted when caravans threatened to choose safer hills. Municipal councils that suddenly funded more lamps for alleys leading to the palace. Night stretches, and our lamp returns to a map of Syria and the coast. We have seen viziers fall, sieges pause, and cities think twice. Now we will turn to the quieter interior life of those who chose this perilous path. How they ate, prayed, studied, and argued. How they courted love under the weight of dangerous work. How they measured a life well lived when the measure could be as small as a letter sealed well and delivered on time. A kind of courage waits in those rooms, and it speaks more. Indeed, morning in a high fortress tasted of barley and mint, bread baked against hot stones, the crust lifted by steam that smelled faintly of wild thyme. A boy carried a pail from the cistern with both hands and felt the water as cold like advice. Lessons began early, recitation in low voices, a page of law beside a page of poetry so that duty and beauty learned to stand together without quarrel. In a side room, an elder taught sums with beans, moving them across a bowl until a student could count the cost of a mistake without blushing. Frugality was not a mood, it was breath. Prayer framed the day lightly but firmly. There was no shouting in devotion, no theater. The call rose, the rose formed, the words flowed like a river through familiar stones. Quiet afterward served as a second lesson. Hold stillness in the mind even as orders fly. In that stillness, students revised maps. They practiced naming streets in a city they had never seen, tested their sense of direction against drawings made by travelers. Each path learned in imagination becomes a calmer footfall later. Meals reinforced the ethos. The pot was simple. Grains, a handful of pulses, greens when the terraces were kind, yogurt when the sheep gave more than expected. Spices were used as commas, not exclamation points. A visiting dignitary might receive honey and almonds, but ceremony kept its boots clean. Waste was a rumor that died fast. A child who learned to scrape a pot politely learned to pack a bag that would not betray him with sound. Debate was a cherished craft. In a shaded courtyard, two students argued an ethical knot. If a warning letter could prevent a killing, was the writer allowed to frighten? One argued for minimal force, another for truthful weight. The mentor let them press each other until they found the slope between cowardice and cruelty. The point was not to win but to grow precise. Precision in thought became precision in step, and precision in step kept people alive. Love did not excuse anyone from carefulness. In the evenings music found a respectful volume. Couples walked the upper path under the same stars that watched armies try their luck on plains below. A whispered promise had to fit inside duty, not break it. Letters of courtship were modest and exact. Gifts were practical, with a flourisher needle cased bright with lacquer, a scarf stitched with a pattern that doubled as a map of a shared memory. The perilous life did not forbid tenderness. It asked tenderness to wear boots. The young feeder learned to read faces the way a scribe reads a manuscript that has survived a fire. For gaps, for patches, for a line that runs too smoothly to be true. He practiced holding his gaze like an ordinary man's gaze, with interest that comes and goes. He rehearsed small smiles that end before they turn into invitations. He learned to help without leaving a name behind. A stranger remembered for kindness may be too remembered for safety. Anonymity, he was told, is not coldness, it is stewardship of purpose. Women worked the same crafts that kept the place exact. They kept accounts, directed stores, drafted letters whose softness often bent stubborn officials. Some served as couriers under the shield of ordinary errands. Their presence in the ledger was not a note in the margin, it was an ink that never dried out. Children watched them measure flour and policy with the same hand and learned that steadiness rarely calls attention to itself. Punishment, when required, was a narrow tool. Loud penalties teach the wrong lesson that power must shout to be real. Quiet correction taught better habits. A guard who dozed learned double rounds under supervision until sleep feared his name. A courier who grew fond of taverns walked with a mentor for a month and learned the difference between local news and wasteful noise. Expulsion was rare and final. Mercy was frequent and firm. Stories from outside arrived like weather. Travelers brought gossip about princes who bought safety with silver and then spent twice as much on fear. They brought market rumors, troop counts, a list of gates that stuck in rain. These details folded into teaching. A master would assign an exercise, plan a market exit if this gate jams and that bridge floods. The students would sketch routes across the tile floor with a wetted fingertip, mindful of where lanterns hung and where a cart might topple and give cover. In this interior life, courage looked more like patience than fire. The community kept risk on a short leash. Children learned that a lock is a kindness to everyone who sleeps near it. Artisans learned that a straight line cut today saves 7 crooked lines tomorrow. Clerics learned that counsel begins with listening for the sentence a man is afraid to finish, and the feeder learned that the bravest choice is sometimes the letter that keeps a blade asleep. From such rooms the craft stepped into busy streets. A festival could hide a mission. A fast day could thin a crowd. A wedding could excuse a visit to a well-guarded house. The ordinary world, properly read, offered more doors than a palace corridor. Read it poorly, and even a quiet lane could become a funnel you cannot climb back out of. We will walk one such lane now, where a courier's mistake almost broke a season of work, and a cook's habit of rinsing knives twice rescued 3 names from a list that would have ended them. The lesson is simple and hard. Safety is a choir of small, exact acts. The lane sloped toward the mosque, pebbles set like punctuation in clay. Harun carried a packet sewn into his sash, a brief letter meant to stop a quarrel before it hardened into grief. He had walked this route for weeks with a basket of herbs good cover near kitchens and courtyards. Today he was on time, but the street was not. A spilled crate, a stubborn dog, small delays that loosened plans. He adjusted his pace and rehearsed his smile. The packet rode his hip like a small truth that must arrive before lies grew tall. The plan was simple: enter by the side gate, hand a letter to the laundry woman who never missed a dawn, and leave with her usual bundle of aprons as camouflage. But the laundry woman's daughter was ill, and a substitute had taken her place, a cousin with chatter that tugged attention. Worse, the new gate guard was eager to be noticed. The question came, casual, "Your name?" Harun answered with the one he had worn for months. "Where do you live?" He gave the district and the alley with the broken hinge. "What did you deliver yesterday?" He said mint, and the guard surprised him with "and dill," a baited path. Harun nodded as if dill were merely another green thing, but caution rose. He kept walking, calm hands on a calm basket, searching for a seam. That seam appeared in a kitchen where steam rose in orderly pillars. A cook rinsed knives twice, a habit from a near miss long ago. She didn't glance up when Harun set the basket on the table. "Late," she said, true by her scale. He apologized and gave the phrase only she would recognize. The mint was shy. She paused, wiped a blade and took the packet, hiding the exchange in the work of drying. The substitute laundress chattered. The guard peered. The routine held. Curiosity survived the onions. The guard followed Harun to the gate and asked to see the basket. Harun let him. The herbs were real. The string was real. The bottom held nothing. "You went straight to the kitchen," the guard observed. Harun matched his tone. "Greens faint in heat." The guard weighed this with the pride of a teacher who spots a lesson and waved him through. It might have ended there if the second rinse hadn't brushed the packet. Water bloats paper. The cook felt the change. She understood what the guard would see if he doubled back. A swollen edge, a stain that suggested secrets. She slid the letter into a dry apron and returned the damp cloth. Then she told the substitute laundress, "The dye is delicate today," and the woman, flattered to be trusted, carried the right bundle to the right door. The letter arrived with no more drama than a folded napkin. That night, the reply came back by another path, a promise to return a hostage at the next market, a schedule moved by one day, a tax reduced by the span of a hand. None of this will decorate a chronicle, but it kept the families whole and a road clear of sudden mourning. Harun slept the kind of sleep that does not boast. The cook said nothing about the paper's brief swim. The laundress's daughter recovered. The guard admired his own cleverness and became easier to read. From this small choreography comes a rule. Craft survives its own mistakes when habits are strong. The cook's rinsing ritual was a quiet technology. The coded phrase was a rail for attention. The basket had no false bottom because the best misdirection is the truth that belongs where it is. And the plan contained alternatives: a second messenger 2 streets away, another exit through a crooked courtyard. Precision is not perfection. It is redundancy fitted to real life. Elsewhere, similar rituals bloomed. In one town, a candle left burning meant "do not approach," sparing a visitor from questions. In another, a prayer 1 syllable longer meant the gate captain has changed. These were small human-sized tools, easy to teach and hard to notice. They let a community act with steadiness rather than panic. Between greeting and danger there is often only a breath. Wood smells of resin, sandals whisper on rushes, and a bow becomes a hinge. In that hinge, reputation tightens the room before any hand reaches the latch. Now the map widens to meet a prince who believed, for one afternoon, that friendship had replaced caution. At Acre, a man entered with deference and left with a story stain. The wound became legend, wrapped in talk of poison and miraculous rescue. We will dress the scene without its later ornaments, hold to the core, and let you hear the knock at the door, the softness of greeting, the hidden edge that bent English memory for a generation. Before we open that door, breathe out. The Perilous life is not only bright episodes, it is the grey discipline between them. The cook rinsing twice, the courier leaving early, the ant sowing a seam that will not give. It is neighbors who do not brag and guards who count their own footsteps. Inside that climate, remarkable acts need few sparks. With that climate in mind, we step to Acre's threshold, where a small blade asks a large question about trust, and a prince answers with blood and breath. Acre's light fell in bright squares through the shutters, and the room smelled of sea and tallow. Edward Prince, now king later, had let his guard relax to the steady rhythm of routine. The visitor was known to someone who mattered, or said he was, and deference wrapped him like clean cloth. He brought words of goodwill, and perhaps the hope of alliance under a sky tide of war. A servant poured water, the door leaned back into its frame. That was all the space the moment needed. The blade was small, the gesture courteous until it wasn't. A gift offered, a hand that lingers, the twist that turns courtesy into damage. The prince's reflex was faster than the visitor's plan, or perhaps luck did the work that training had begun. A cut, a shout, a grapple, and then the room contained three truths. The attacker, disarmed and seized. The prince, wounded. The guard, suddenly very awake. Was the knife smeared with poison? Some chronicles insist, others call the fever that followed an ordinary illness given a mask so the tale could bow to romance. The rescue grows taller in retellings, a loyal figure sucking poison from the wound. A miracle of devotion, the prince rising from his bed like a pledge made flesh. The sober core stays small and hard. A man gained access under a flag of respect. He struck. He failed to finish. The prince lived and learned a lesson that other rulers already knew. England carried the scene home. Doors thickened. Etiquette grew spines. The word assassin, already warmed by Tyre, now settled into English with a personal aftertaste. It stopped being only a mountain rumor and became a chamber memory. That shift mattered. It taught audiences to see peril in politeness, to hear the hinge in a bow. The craft had always played that note. Now the tune had a wider choir, pause on the attacker's path. He had rehearsed for months, perhaps years. He learned which servants to greet, which corners to ignore, how long a devout man scans a room before his eyes rest. He chose a robe remembered as acceptable, not notable. He practiced waiting, the hardest skill, and when the hour came, his hand did not shake. If his blade carried poison, it was not theater, it was redundancy. If it did not, the closeness alone was designed to finish what steel began. Countermeasures catch up slowly and then all at once. After Acre, inner guards began treating conversation as a kind of corridor with checkpoints. A petitioner might be asked to repeat a phrase in a second language, to sit when he expected to stand, to hand a gift to a third party and accept its return. Each detour was a wall disguised as politeness. Houses kept spare rooms that felt official but were buffers. The visitor felt honored. The host kept his perimeter, Nizari circles. The story of Acre was not sung, it was audited. Somewhere, in a small room with 2 candles, a master traced the mistake with a finger, and asked what had been learned: the angle of a wrist, the danger of overlong deference, the risk in trusting an intermediary's endorsement. The craft could succeed brilliantly one week and fail simply the next because real life is noise. The remedy was not rage, it was better checklists. From Acre our road turns inland again to consider the mathematics of fear. How many guards does a rumor hire? How much grain does a city lose when caravans choose the longer road to a gate with gentler stories? The Perilous life did not need to win battles to change budgets. A single attempted murder could raise the interest rate of an entire province. Scribes recorded this without poetry. Our treasury's ledgers are an epic in columns. Meanwhile the etymology kept arguing in the margins. Hashashayan said enemies, as if intoxication were the only explanation for courage at arm's length. "People of principle," replied defenders, pointing to discipline that no drug could sustain over decades. Scholars afterward untie and retie the knot, reminding readers that insults often fossilize into names. Whatever the root, the branch bore fruit, a word Europe used for any planned killing, until its history nearly vanished under ink. Take one more glance at the room in Acre. The water cup is still on the table. The shutters have not moved. Outside, Gaul's arc is yesterday. Inside, a habit has changed. That is how this history works. A quiet alteration in posture that ripples outward for years. Because this is a tale for rest, we end not with a shout but with a breath and invitation to notice how composure, once wounded, can be taught new armor and still walk softly. Our next steps go backward in time, to the early wiring of the network itself, recruitment, oaths, and the patient methods by which a small community learned to tug at the sleeves of empires. We will meet a teacher who explained courage as carefulness and a student who nearly failed at both. Their lesson became a template, copied many times, and it will bring us to the edge of a market where a single phrase, politely spoken, saved a decade from catching fire. Before blades and letters there were rooms, and in those rooms a teacher with a voice that never hurried. He taught courage as carefulness. "Bravery is not heat," he said, "it is temperature control." He began with small disciplines. How to sit so a robe never snags. How to keep breath even when a question tries to climb it. How to drink without looking like a man measuring time. Students learned to carry themselves as if the day were ordinary, because most days were, and craft must live there. Oaths did not thunder. 2 witnesses a short vow, a palm pressed to a page. The pledge fit inside a single breath so it could be remembered when other breaths were too expensive. Promises were bounded. Never seek noise. Never harm more than the purpose demands. Never forget the door you came in by. Each line was a rail for future steps. A trainee practiced saying "I was mistaken" without pride, curdling the phrase. He practiced gratitude that sounds like the road, not like a court. The teacher's name was Fared, and his hardest student was Qasim, whose talent for mimicry made him lazy about noticing. Qasim could borrow a gait by watching 3 steps. He could copy a signature after 2 glances. He also trusted luck like a friend. Farid disliked luck. "Luck is a guest," he said, "and guests leave." So he assigned Qasim boredom. 3 months tending an herb stall, learning the weight of parsley, the price of rain, and the sound a buyer makes when lying kindly. Boredom fixed what luck had bent. Qasim learned that a market is a pillow pressed to a city's ear. He scented rumor. He learned which traders bragged, which listened, and which could be moved by a small discount to repeat a gifted sentence in the right room. He learned a city's rhythm the way a smith learns heat. And he learned that silence is a kind of generosity. The more you keep, the more useful the bit you share becomes. One morning Farid joined him, just another man deciding between fennel and mint. He asked questions without moving his lips. Why does that guard pat the same pocket twice? Why does the baker's boy pass the olives before the bread? Why does the money changer tap his tray when a certain woman approaches? Qasim answered slowly, surprised to hear himself sound precise. The lesson ended with a cloth folded in a particular way. Inside lay a letter small as a fig leaf. The mission looked like a purchase. The district chief was greasing a quarrel to seize a rival's courtyard. Families would bleed, trade would stumble, and the wrong men would prosper. The letter carried a pressure point. The chief's nephew would be traveling with 2 companions along a lane where a certain shutter sticks. The message offered a choice wrapped in courtesy: step back from the seizure, or discover how close strangers could stand without raising dust. Delivery would be simple: a greeting at the well, a compliment on horses, a folded cloth. Qasim almost broke it. He chose the wrong hour, when the well drew fewer people than usual and attention fell like a net. He held the cloth too carefully. A watcher's eye sharpened. Farid intervened with nothing but tone. He asked loudly about prices, haggled badly on purpose, and made Qasim look like a generous fool. The watcher decided that anyone so loose with coins could not be tied with secrets. Qasim completed the handoff. His heart completed 3 extra loops. The city returned to its noise. The reply arrived by gesture. The district chief posted a notice scolding disorder and praising mercy. No courtyard was seized. Behind the ink stood the arithmetic of self-preservation. The nephew later praised his uncle's wisdom at a banquet. He never realized he still had breath to attend. Farid counted it a win of the best kind, the kind that leaves no bruise on the map. At night, Qasim confessed his mistake. I held the cloth like a message, he said. Farid smiled. Every tool wants to brag, he answered. Teach it modesty. He assigned Qasim 3 more weeks of boredom, then a new task. Visit a scribe and learn how much ink a threat needs. The answer proved small. Most men read what they fear, even when the page is nearly blank. Training widened into other crafts. How to greet in a dialect without overdoing it. How to pray with a visiting caravan without leading. How to ask a child a question that tests what his parents don't say. Apprentices learned inventory like liturgy. A ledger could map loyalties. A sack that always weighed a little heavy might mean a god whose mother needed medicine, and therefore a gate that might someday open for kindness rather than coin. The market phrase that saved a decade came during this season. A feud between 2 clans in a river town was ready to boil. Farid sent Qasim with herbs and a mouthful of patience. He found a matriarch choosing coriander. He said, "This year's flood sits higher in the reeds." She heard what the sentence carried. The watermarks on her warehouse door were visible from the lane. A fire, should one begin, would travel like a map. The feud cooled in a week. 10 years later, that town still bought mint by the handful. Training ended where it began. A room, a candle, a vow, whispered again, not for drama, but to check the fit. Qasim had learned to be brave by narrowing his gestures until purpose could step between them without scraping. Farid had taught him to be a man who leaves less wake than his shadow. They parted with ordinary words, which is how such work prefers to travel. From teacher and student we turned toward a city that prized the same thoughts for a different reason. A place where merchants solved problems that armies only complicated, where a single copied line in a ledger could spare 20 men from brave deaths. There, a quiet strike changed nothing that could be weighed, and everything that could be decided. The city loved numbers more than banners. Warehouses faced the harbor like neat teeth, each door painted with a mark that told a story only clerks could hear. Here, coin cooled tempers that swords heated. A caravan arriving on time could stop a feud before it learned its own name. In this place, a single copied line payment received. Ship cleared. Toll forgiven could stand between 2 families in a winter of grudges. That is why the Nizari liked such streets. They were tuned to consequence. They listened. A dispute had begun to ferment between a spice guild and a governor's brother. The brother wanted a monopoly license. The guild wanted air. Lawyers sharpened quills. Sailors whispered that cargoes would be redirected south if the brother won. The city understood the threat. Ships do not argue, they vanish. A letter, folded into a cloth bag of pepper, reached a guild elder who read by touch before he read by sight. It outlined a misfortune waiting patiently for the brother on a certain balcony where a certain marble was cracked. The words did not snarl. They offered accounting. This action will cost you that outcome. The elder met the governor under a canopy that made shade look expensive. He spoke softly about ships, not about blades. He placed ledgers where the light flattered the columns. He suggested a compromise dressed as generosity. Lowered the toll for a season. Let licenses be many and brief, and collect praise instead of bribes. The governor's brother was not present, but his future exhaled behind the numbers like a draft under a door. The governor signed something that felt like wisdom and tasted like relief. The city's temperature dropped by a degree you could feel only in the evening. Who ordered the letter? The guild thought it was an ally disguised as caution. The palace thought it was a rival disguised as fate. The Nizari preferred that question to stay interesting. Their craft here was not a dagger at all. It was a ledger line written at the right hour. A week later, a balcony was repaired for pride's sake. The crack vanished. So did the need to test whether the warning had been literal. That is a piece worth the price of a mason. In that same season, a consignment of glass from the coast arrived with fewer breakages than usual. A clerk noticed and wrote to the maker to ask why. The answer came back simple: thicker straw, better knots, patience in loading. The clerk added a note to his manual: craft breeds craft. A city that learns one good habit becomes a harder place for panic to sell itself. The Nizari were not the only teachers in that town. They were merely the ones who insisted that foresight pay its own way. One evening, a minor official was found dead in a lane, a dagger tidy in his ribs. The rumor machine lurched to its favorite song. Assassin, someone said, meaning only that closeness had done the work. The guild elder sighed. He knew how easily a clean death could be recruited by a dirty cause. He asked for lamps to be hung in that lane, not to trap shadows but to teach walkers that light is a decision. The lamps cut the gossip's legs. The death became an isolated sorrow rather than a banner. In its quieting you can hear how a community chooses whether fear will collect interest. In the harbor, ropes sang against bollards. A sailor told a story about a distant mountain where men trained in gardens of illusion. The clerk who had ordered better straw smiled and changed the subject to tides. In that pivot lay an ethic. Admire what is useful. Do not feed what is merely excited. A useful lesson traveled farther that night than a glittering lie did. Somewhere far inland, a teacher would have nodded at the balance. The governor's brother left town for a while, officially, to inspect roads. Unofficially, to let dignity sleep until it woke less hungry. He returned with a new idea, a festival sponsored by the office, with toll remissions as gifts. Merchants forgave him because coin is a kind of apology when spent well. The Nizari wrote nothing more about balconies. Success is best left without commentary. Sometimes the craft had to cut. A visiting envoy plotted a provocation built to stampede a treaty into failure. He bribed 2 captains and a cantor to spread a lie about blasphemy at the docks. The lie was timed for market day and for the hour when voices climb without effort. A courier caught the thread, handed it to a scribe whose talent was tone, and the scribe wrote a sermon that turned the festival toward patience. The envoy found himself applauding a piece he had meant to injure. He sailed away angry and safe. The city paid him that mercy because it preferred profit to drama. In such places, the perilous life wears plain shoes. The work is less about single bright acts than about repeating motions until they become climate. Rinse the knife, light the lane, write the short letter, check the knot. Whisper the market phrase that helps a matriarch hear the river's height in time. The ledger thickens with small, right choices. When harm tries to enter, it must pay toll twice. From this merchant city we can see another slope, a court where theater could not be avoided, and where the craft had to step into glare and still hold its proportion. There, on a morning of formal audiences, 2 men in pilgrim cloaks waited to bow, and a dispute that had pretended to be theology showed its bones as policy. The blade that followed was not maximal, it was measured. Its echo rearranged a council without spilling a crowd. We climbed toward that doorway now, careful in our own footsteps, because courts remember how you move before they remember what you say. The room will be bright, the act will be narrow, the result will travel farther than the sound. The audience chamber blazed with polished brass and patient incense. Courtiers formed eddies around obligation, each robe a small kingdom of ambition. The ruler sat high under a canopy that made sunlight kneel. On the far side of the mat, 2 pilgrims waited with hands folded, industrial on their cloaks, fatigued, carefully arranged. They had letters to present, petitions soft as linen. They had questions whose answers were already packed in the folds of their sleeves. This court had been arguing theology for a month. The dispute sounded pious. Jurists swayed phrases like jewelers, but its skeleton was policy. A governor wanted a freer hand to tax a trade route. A rival wanted the route to remain clear for his allies. Clerics were recruited as banners for causes that could not speak their names. The pilgrim's arrival fit the day's costume. Sincerity on the surface, motive beneath the weave. Etiquette moved the clock. Petitioners walked a prescribed path, bowed at measured angles, and spoke when stewards' toes pointed. The 2 pilgrims stepped as they had practiced. A steward lifted the petition. The first seal was wax. The second was gutstring knotted in a pattern known to few. The steward felt the knot paused, and glanced toward a counselor whose eyes hid arithmetic. Permission flickered. A reading began. Words praised the ruler's justice, admired his moderation, applauded his reforms, and then, very gently, placed a pebble on the scale. A reminder that a certain governor had dismissed an envoy in a manner that taught others to disrespect authority. The phrasing made obedience sound fashionable. The ruler's mouth softened. He nodded. He signaled the pilgrims closer. Close was the craft's favorite distance. One held the scroll while the other adjusted the edge to prevent the parchment from curling. A sleeve lifted, blade, thin as a reed and twice as patient, slid into daylight. The strike was not theatrical. It was a correction delivered to the rib that turns breath into voice. The target was not the ruler but the governor es advocate, the drafter of edicts that made markets stumble. He folded without commotion. A breath interrupted rather than a speech cut short. Shock tumbled through the chamber, then stopped at the wall built by etiquette. Guards moved, but not wildly. Doors closed, but without slam. The pilgrims did not run. They lowered their eyes and surrendered. The room held its shape. A court trained to honor form used form to keep panic from owning the hour. The message was plain without speech. Punctuation, not massacre. A name underlined, not erased. The ruler read the grammar swiftly. He recalled the governor under pretext of consultation. He cooled the debate. He asked the market overseer for a proclamation on fairness and summoned lamp-keepers to add light on the streets. None of these acts mentioned daggers. All of them answered one. Interrogations followed. One pilgrim spoke softly, in the register used for recipes, confirming affiliation but refusing to rent motive to any patron present. The other kept the older custom of silence. Chroniclers later inflated both into theater. The practical aftermath mattered more. The policy died without a funeral. Clerics found sturdier topics. Caravans returned to arguing with prices instead of soldiers. Analysis in the mountain school praised restraint. The strike had been narrow, its echo large. It avoided martyr-making and headlong reprisals. It used the court's own choreography to announce that proximity could be polite and decisive at once. Notes were copied. The angle of approach, the timing of the bow, the length of parchment needed to hide a reed blade. Apprentices practiced with rolled mats until wrists remembered the path that eyes could not catch. But craft is never a trophy. It is rented grace. A season later, a checkpoint nearly unmasked the team because an apprentice added a flourish to a bow. The correction was immediate and kind. "Gravity is our ally," the master said. "Do not make it chase you." Rituals were tightened. Petitions were shortened so that hands had less space to misbehave. The game learned the game's reply. The court remembered. The ruler kept theology in the madrasa and taxes on a shorter leash. He invited merchants to speak first at councils and let guilds prepare toll schedules that changed with the river's depth. He thanked clerics in public and paid inspectors in private. The balance looked delicate and felt firm. Visitors asked about security. Stewards poured tea. Hospitality, too, can be a policy. From this bright chamber our road winds back to stone and salt, to Marsyov's terraces, to the letters that kept swords asleep, to the winter when snow cut the passes and messages had to ride in the memory of men who could not afford to forget. In that season, a decision taken by a library saved a valley's spring. And far away, in Europe, a word shed another layer of history and became costume silk for stages, leather for stories, while the quieter truth kept teaching anyone patient enough to listen. Winter taught even tidy fortresses to improvise. Snow braided the passes and then pulled them tight. Mules stepped like scholars choosing words. The cistern lids froze in thin glass. Breath turned arguments into fog. In such weather, messages rode inside people. A courier left with nothing written, only a prayer-shaped sentence hidden in a familiar blessing. He repeated it to himself with each switchback so that memory could warm its hands. When he reached the first village, the blessing sounded ordinary. Only the matriarch heard the second melody inside it and sent a boy to open a sluice that no one touched before spring. The library's decision began earlier, when a farmer climbed to Marsyov with a small problem dressed as courtesy. The autumn had been generous. The terraces sat heavy with promise. If snow arrived too quickly and melted too cruelly, the valley would drink too fast and choke on abundance. The librarians listened as carefully as jurists. They laid maps across tables, traced the water's old conversations, and wrote a plan in the language of ditches and patience. Keep this channel clear. Block that one with brush. Leave a gap where goats like to wander so a child will notice the change and fetch an elder. Knowledge became carpentry again. The plan could not travel on parchment. Paper would tear, blur, betray. It traveled in proverbs, adjusted by one word, in recipes with one extra pinch, in a festival song that added a line about water that waits for the right bowl. The couriers rehearsed like actors, but their stage was kitchens, paths, and shed doors. When the storm came, the valley met it with a choreography that looked like common sense hastily discovered. In the thaw, the terraces sipped instead of gulped. A flood failed to happen. The only audience was gratitude that did not know where to send thanks. Inside the fortress, the librarians shelved their maps and taught the next lesson. Write for people who do not know you exist. One of them said, "Power is the art of making strangers cooperate." a student added, and of making friends unexcited. Both were right. The perilous life was not all knives and notes. It was also good drainage, clean wells, and the humility to borrow a proverb instead of inventing a speech. Snow also pressed letters into quieter shapes. Threats felt gauche in such cold. Diplomacy wore wool, offers of salt, of shared grazing, of lantern oil to keep a watch warm through the last mean hours before dawn. Enemies noticed the weather too. A governor paused his temper because even rage disliked slipping. There were small truces sealed by soup, by a rope lent to pull a cart free, by the promise that a messenger crossing a ridge would not be questioned on that day because questions freeze lips and break meaning. Far away, winter had another face. In European halls, the word assassin threw off history like a heavy cloak and kept only its shine. Minstrels set it to meter. Scribes sprinkled it through romances where proof did not matter and pasted. A listener might imagine masked orders and gardens of dream, the old man beckoning from a balcony hung with impossible fruit, the truth apprentices rehearsing exits, librarians shaping floods, women budgeting lamp oil did not make good theater, but it made better cities. Back in Syria, a small crisis tested those quiet arts. A convoy bringing grain to a snow-stung town stalled in a gulch. The lead mule slipped. Sacks burst, men shouted in the brittle air. A young Fidar traveling as a merchant, his nephew looked at the mess and chose the most unheroic tool available. He stopped the shouting first, because heat wastes breath. He sent 2 men ahead to spread sand from a bag meant for lamps. He cut and rewove ropes so the load rode lower. He paid the driver of a rival cart to lend his narrow plank, and paid him again to praise the idea loudly so the pride in the original team could survive. The convoy moved. No letters, no steel, only habits. The town greeted the grain with ceremonial calm. The imam folded the rescue into his sermon as if it had been faith all along. The magistrate quietly credited the merchantess account with a remission on road tolls for foresight, a phrase that felt like poetry stolen from arithmetic. The young traveler sent a small report to Mashiach that read like a housekeeping list. Somewhere a teacher smiled and underlined a line, "We saved breath before we saved grain." When the passes opened, the library took stock. They had burned less wood than planned, given more salt, copied to treatises on irrigation, and quietly strengthened an alliance with a monastery that kept the only level bench in 3 valleys. The abbot received lamp oil and, in exchange, a lecture on Watergates that folded theology into grace, the librarian said, arrives at the right rate. The abbot liked that Europe kept polishing the mask. A chronicler, eager to please nobles with crisp nerves, wrote a scene in which a youth OD'd on mystic gardens and woke eager to off-D himself for a master's glance. The tale spread because it excused fear and flattered bravado. Meanwhile, in ledger rooms and kitchens, the perilous life continued to prefer arithmetic to ecstasy. If a myth kept enemies guessing, the communities did not rush to correct it. Fog can be a fence. As winter retreated, the craft returned to brighter streets. A spring fair would draw rivals, allies, spies, and poets under the same awnings. The Nizari would send letters dressed as compliments, receive letters dressed as rebukes, and measure which tone moved which person. A single vendor placed so that 2 quarrelsome cousins met near his stall could accomplish more than a dozen riders. The library packed its maps, sent couriers with nothing written, and reminded everyone to watch the ditches. The season's last snow took its time, melting in shadowed corners, like a rumor unwilling to leave. The fortresses breathed, the valleys listened, and distant halls continued to rehearse their brighter lies. Between the 2 worlds, the perilous life walked the ridgeline it always had, a narrow path where steady feet beat grand speeches every time. The next chapter waits in a tent where a prince bargains for mercy he will call policy, and a letter on thin paper teaches him which of his advisers hears with both ears. The prince's tent was theater and canvas. Carpets softened decisions, braziers perfumed impatience, and a bowl of pomegranates pretended there was time for fruit. Outside, scribes argued with dust. Inside, a counselor rehearsed the word leniency until it lost taste. The prince wanted peace that looked like victory. He wanted taxes to flow without marching. He wanted letters to do what spears did not. 3 advisers fanned him with 3 winds. One urged iron, one murmured silk. One listened so carefully that silence gathered around him like a cloak. A messenger from the hills arrived without rustle. His courtesy was the sort that never asked to be admired. He presented a letter on paper thin enough to show the prince his own finger through it. The seal was plain, the script tidy, the message brief. Return the elder you seized last month under pretext. Reopen the road by the lime groves. Rotate the gate guard at the east post. In exchange, your caravans will arrive with no missing sacks, and your envoys will not find knives where greetings should be. It ended with a sentence the tent felt rather than read. We attend to details, so must you. The Iron Advisor shouted for a reply written in troops. The Silk Advisor drafted an apology too sweet to swallow. The Quiet Advisor asked to see the paper's edge. He held it to the brazier and watched the fibers drink heat. This was stored dry, he said, carried close to breath. It came the long way to avoid a gate where questions are clumsy. He asked the messenger for water, not for the prince's sake, but to see whether the man lifted the cup with a servant's hand or a guest's. The messenger drank like a man used to both roles. The prince proposed a test. We return the elder, he said, but we keep him close as our friend. The Quiet Advisor shook his head. Friendship that advertises itself as a prison, he said. Return him to his own door, where neighbors can see him grow older without fear. That is a policy, not a romance. The Iron Advisor scoffed. The Silk Advisor smiled as if he had said it. The prince weighed reputations like coins and chose the advice that made him seem both firm and merciful. He signed an order. He pretended it was his idea. Another line in the letter named the East Gate. Why that one? The Quiet Advisor sent a runner to watch, disguised as a pilgrim who counted prayers by knots. The gate captain had grown comfortable. He greeted petitioners by name and habit has a smell. The runner returned with a list of 6 routines an observant stranger could map from a low roof. The prince frowned and ordered rotations. The Iron Advisor called it paranoia. The Quiet Advisor called it a tune in a new key. Negotiations unfolded like patient embroidery. The messenger brought a second note that praised restraint and suggested a rate for road tolls that merchants would call fair and rulers would call tolerable. It also included a detail that only someone near the prince's stove could know. That last week the cook had oversalted the stew and that 2 guards had traded portions. The prince sat straighter. The tent seemed smaller. He realized with a coolness he admired that he had been taught to hear his own room. Who leaks? Asked the Iron Advisor, reaching for rage. What changes? Asked the Silk Advisor, reaching for compromise. What do we learn? Asked the Quiet Advisor, reaching for a ledger. He proposed small, clean steps. Separate the steward from the gate captain's cousin for a month. Move the night watch 1 lamp width farther from the entry. Pay the cook a little more and ask him to salt more precisely. If you raise the whole sea, he said, you drown the very ships that carry you. The prince left anger to men with noisier beards and adopted the quiet plan. The elder returned home under the eyes of a street that expected theater and received policy. The road by the lime groves opened with a proclamation that praised the ruler's mercy and mentioned no one else. The East Gate learned new hours. The captain learned new humility. Caravans arrived with softer stories. A treaty appeared on paper like dew cool brief, and enough to tell plants they could keep growing. The messenger's 3rd visit carried an epilogue folded like a shadow. It thanked the prince for understanding how to hear with both ears. 1 ear for honor, 1 for outcomes. It suggested a mercy that cost nothing and bought time. Free a pair of minor debtors to show that peace is not only for markets. The Iron Advisor sputtered. They test us. The Quiet Advisor nodded. They train us. The prince released the men. The tent exhaled. Around them, rumor did its work. Enemies called the prince weak for choosing letters over lances. Merchants called him wise for turning spears into receipts. The balance held because he fed it daily. Small fairnesses, small frictions, small reminders to the guard that the next polite question might be the important one. He learned to make hospitality a wall and a welcome at once. The Quiet Advisor never took credit. He handed victories to the prince like clean towels. The messenger left a final courtesy, a list of 4 markets where disputes would be offered to the prince first, because reputation travels quickest on dry roads. The prince agreed to judge them lightly, and the hills agreed to send their whispers elsewhere when possible. It was not friendship, it was commerce in fear, denominated in habits. That night, the prince ate simply and slept with the lamp at halfway. He heard the camp the way a sailor hears rigging. A dog barked twice. A sentry corrected his stance. A scribe coughed the cough of ink dust. He smiled at the thought that a letter had taught him his own perimeter. Outside, the messenger walked into dark that felt comfortable. Inside, the quiet advisor marked 3 lines in a book. Elder returned. Gate rotated. Debtors freed. Hold. He wrote next to each meaning. Repeat until unnecessary. From this tent, we step back toward the ridge where words turn into weather. The craft we are tracing survives because people learn to feel a room differently after the first near miss. It survives because routine, tightened with kindness, resists theater. And it survives because both sides discover that fear, when priced fairly, can be cheaper than pride. Beyond the prince's camp, a monastery bell counts the hour. In that measured sound we will listen for the language that will outlive all of them. The word that slips from history into costume, and the quieter truth that keeps its boots on. Words travel farther than horses, and some change saddles as they go. Assassin began the journey as a slur whispered by enemies, a way to file courage under madness so no one had to study it. In port cities the term became a coat any sly knife could wear. Troubadours preferred the coat to the body underneath. They stitched it with gardens of illusion, with a gray-bearded master waving youths toward glory like a stage director. The tale sold because it was sweet on the tongue and strong in the tavern. It also kept rulers from admitting that their own habits, not sorcery, had opened their doors. A quieter stream of texts insisted on proportion. Jurists wrote about lawful violence, about when a ruler's cruelty justifies a blade and when a blade only multiplies cruelty. Merchants wrote ledgers that showed how rumors adjust prices faster than taxes can. Clerics wrote admonitions that sounded like weather reports. Tone down the sermon, lift the lamp, keep the gate. These counterweights never became popular songs, but they taught cities to breathe more evenly. In their margins you can see the Nizari craft reflected as method rather than marvel, a discipline of scale, a calculus of consequence, a preference for the smallest effective act. Europe refined the mask further. In romances, an assassin grew into a profession with lodges, tokens, and rights. Playwrights made them stride in soft leather and speak in riddles because riddles please audiences who do not plan to change anything after the curtain falls. Painters discovered that a hood paints faster than a library. Printers liked the word because it carried its own advertisement. Readers felt daring just to hold it. With every reuse the term shed history like a cloak and kept a silhouette, yet truth kept its shoes on. Diplomats learned to negotiate by lamplight rather than threaten by noon. Guards learned to smile while counting seams. Princes learned to praise mercy in public and buy information in private. The ledger of habits grew thick across borders. In places where Nizari communities dissolved into ordinary streets, the methods remained as household wisdom. Rinse the knife, ask the extra question, keep the corridor narrow and polite. Children absorbed these things without knowing their inheritance. They grew up in cities that startled less and recovered faster. The etymology debate hummed in scriptoriums, hashkishan or as-sion, intoxication or principle. Scholars argued gently across centuries. Most agreed on one lesson that did not need a root to stand. Enemies will name you for their convenience, and sometimes that name will fund your survival. The Nizari let the fog collect where it helped. When a rumor kept a siege at a respectful distance, no one hurried to sweep it away. When a fable made apprentices careless, teachers set the record straight in rooms without windows. Reality and myth did not always fight. Sometimes they bartered. There were darker chapters, too, in which desperate rulers smeared inconvenient deaths as assassin worked to dodge blame. A courtier cut down by his own faction could be blamed on mountain ghosts. A debt settled with a dagger in an alley became foreign craft instead of domestic rot. The word did political labor, covering stains with a theatrical cloth. Sober clerks sometimes pushed back. They wrote that a crime does not become art because the excuse wears imported silk. They noted times, places, witnesses. They pulled stories back down to the floor. Meanwhile, in the hills, the practice aged. After Alamate's fall and Masyaf's negotiations, communities emphasized survival over reputation. The blade remained an option. The letter remained the favorite tool. Apprentices were taught that theater is expensive. Outcomes are cheap if purchased early. A warning at the right door could save 10 funerals. A truce disguised as market timing could spare a winter. Libraries trained more map readers than knife hands. Grain bins received more praise than daring did. The perilous life was still perilous, but it had learned to build danger hourly rather than salaried. Pilgrims carried the legend onward, sometimes in good faith, sometimes because fear makes generous narrators. One tells of a youth who saw a garden and woke devoted beyond self. Another of an elder who wrote with ink distilled from night. Another of a prince who slept with doors removed from hinges so he could see danger coming. These stories help listeners feel brave without purchasing any habits. They are quilts for cold evenings, but the old manuals say something duller and harder. Move early, ask twice, plant the rumor that averts the parade. Leave the room cleaner than you found it. By the late 13th century, the craft had seeped into the general water supply of governance. Sunni courts that once spat assassin adopted its hygiene, layered thresholds, rotated guards, audits of routine. Crusader outposts folded similar practices into their customs before they packed their reliquaries. Caravansaries put lamps at corners where men argued most, and arguments shortened. You can see the diffusion in petty details in municipal fines for doors left open. In bakehouse rules about who stands nearest the alley. In guild bylaws that ban masks at auctions because too many buyers had friends. When methods become municipal, legend loses ground it never knew it held. Centuries ahead, the mask will belong to playwrights and, later, to devices that flicker in dark rooms. It will leap from mountain schools to stage stages to printed thrillers to games that treat rooftops as invitations. The silhouette will run cleanly. The background will blur into a handsome myth. Viewers will feel a thrill that contains no splinters from real rope. And in quiet archives a few lines will still say, a cook rinsed twice, a clerk counted straw, a prince learned to hear with both ears, a letter arrived on thin paper and arranged a decade. We are not finished. Legends are comfortable beds and sleep stories must be honest about comfort, but they must also keep one eye open. So we turn now to the most stubborn knot in the tale, motive, not just who paid for which blade, but why a community would choose this narrow tool again and again. How creed, minority status, and geography braided into a strategy that walked between empires without being crushed. In that braid is the quietest and most durable lesson the mountains ever exported, and it is about attention more than steel. We will read it strand by strand, then step into the last valleys this story must cross, where collapse looks like scattering and survival looks like ordinary life done very, very well. Begin with a map, not of borders but of slopes. The Nizari were a small creed among larger creeds, nested within Islam and pressed by empires that read difference as disloyalty. Minority is a geography. It makes valleys narrower and winters longer. It teaches that survival is a fraction problem solved daily. In such math, armies are too large a unit. You need tools that fit into pockets. A letter, a borrowed name, a habit that looks like courtesy until it adjusts a treaty. Strategy braided from three strands: belief, position, and pressure held firm because each tightened the others. Belief first. The Nizari held a line of authority their neighbors rejected. That made doctrine more than theology. It was a boundary marker for safety. Loyalty to an imam living, not only an imam remembered, organized patience. It lent courage that did not need flames to prove itself. The creed prized knowledge as devotion, argument as duty, and discipline as proof that faith can breathe under siege. A blade could be an instrument of conscience if wielded with proportion. A letter could be an act of worship if it spared grief. In prayer, they learned steadiness. In study, they learned timing. Together, these became tradecraft with a spine. Position next. High castles and stingy soil do not feed cavalry. They feed attention. From ledges like Alamet and Masyaf, a community could not project force. It could project reputation. Mountains taught the lesson of the narrow pass. One well-chosen place can govern a wider space than its stones deserve. Waterworks and terraces made living possible. Ledges and routes made influence possible. Geography punished waste. Every successful act had to be small, readable, and cheap to repeat. Every mistake had to be survivable. That is why the craft favored proximity over spectacle and grammar over gore. Pressure braided the strands. Seljuks, Zengods, Ayyubids, Franks, and later Mongols and Mamluks played weight on the rope. In a crowded theater, standing still is not neutral. It is refusing someone else's script. The Nizari answered pressure with leverage. They turned their reputation into a tariff other powers paid in caution. They sold truces that cost less than campaigns. They bought time with needles instead of drums. They understood that a minority cannot afford final victories. It must prefer recoverable ones. Their success metric was not flags on walls. It was the number of children who grew up thinking carefulness was ordinary. Motive then was not mystery or madness, it was stewardship. To persist, a small people must shrink the arena until scale and conscience can meet. That meant avoiding aimless harm because backlash multiplies. It meant choosing targets whose removal edited policy rather than fed martyrdom. It meant writing to a prince's fear of embarrassment rather than his hunger for war. It meant treating rumor as irrigation. Guide it, slow it, let it nourish what should grow and starve what should not. The creed taught the why. The mountains taught the how. The enemies taught the when. Tactics reflected the braid. Disguise was not desecration. It was modesty under pressure. Oaths emphasized exits because survival is the proof of prudence. Letters carried courtesy because pride is loud and loudness is a liability. Apprentices learned to keep their own house exactly in locks, measured portions, lamp oil tracked, because a sloppy room breeds sloppy plans. When a strike came, it arrived like punctuation in a line already drafted by weeks of observation. Afterwards, communities returned to quiet work fast, wiping fingerprints off the day. Critics, some sincere, some convenient, called the craft cruelty wrapped in cleverness. The answer from the ledgers was arithmetic. Unpicked wars, unburned granaries, unbroken lines of trade, and funerals averted by a page. Mercy can be cold when it is proportional. It is warmer than spectacle. The perilous life never pretended innocence. It claimed economy, the smallest effective act, chosen last. Scattering did not break the braid. It thinned it into threads that could pass through cloth. After Alamate's fall, families carried the discipline into river towns and caravan stops. The method hid inside ordinary excellence. A clerk who balanced columns so well that panic could not recruit him. A guard who asked one more polite question. A midwife who knew which rumor to keep from traveling. Diaspora turned craft into culture. When practice becomes habit and habit becomes local wisdom, survival modes outlive the names that forged them. Meanwhile, the mask traveled farther than the people. Assassin became a stage ward. The braid could not follow it into tavern rhyme. But the braid did not need applause. It needed adoption. Sunni courts, crusader castles, and merchant councils stole the useful parts. Rotated guards, tiered thresholds, audits of daily routine, diplomacy that adjusted tone to temperature. Opponents learned to be better governments by fearing those they maligned. That, too, is a motive worth naming, to force competence on power. There were failures. A misread mood at a feast, a disguise that fit too well and drew notice by neatness, a letter whose courtesy sounded like mockery to the wrong ear. Backlash could be swift, and innocence paid. Manuals added cautions. Sharpen empathy, strip flourish. Prefer the rumor that prevents a blade to the blade that repairs a rumor. The braid survived by editing itself after every bruise. What remains when you subtract castles and add centuries is this: an ethic of attention. See rooms as maps, see people as routes, see fear as a resource to spend sparingly. Measure every act by whether tomorrow can carry it without limping. In that ethic, we recognize the most durable motive of all, the will to keep a small community intact without asking the world for permission to exist. That will writes quietly. It chooses tools that fit the hand and leave little noise behind. From motive, we step into the last valleys of our tale. Endings that look like dispersal rather than defeat, legacies that wear everyday clothes, and a language that kept the knife's silhouette but forgot the librarian's lamp. We will let the mountains fade and listen where the method went into kitchens and chancelleries, across ports and parish halls, into laws about lamps and fines for doors. In those places the perilous life became ordinary good sense, and in a final lamplit room, we will fold the map, lower the wick, and leave a blade asleep beside a ledger that still knows how to count. Dispersal looked like ordinary life done well. After the high fortresses thinned into memory, the craft drifted into kitchens, workshops, and small offices where no one applauded competence but everyone relied on it. A city statute required lamps at certain bends. The fine for darkness was small and steady, and arguments shortened because the corners no longer conspired. A market decree banned masks during auctions. Prices steadied, profits rose, tempers cooled. A guild charter added a rule that apprentices rotate stalls every few weeks. strangers found routine harder to map. None of these lines mentioned mountains. All of them carried their weather. In chancelleries, clerks learned a new style for letters that touched nerves: short, cool, exact, with flattery measured like salt. They practiced the sentence that saved the most lives: reconsider. In barracks, guards were taught that courtesy is a gate, not a surrender. The extra question should sound helpful, never proud. In mosques and churches, preachers lowered volume when embers were dry and lifted comfort when markets needed courage more than penance. The ledger of habits rotated, relight, reword, review became municipal muscle. The word assassin kept traveling without luggage. In a Lombard town, a brawl by assassin ways meant only that it happened close and quick. In a French romance, an assassin's oath meant a vow spoken at night beneath a window. In an English chronicle, a murder between cousins turned into the work of assassins, as if blaming geography could absolve kin. The silhouette hardened, the history behind it blurred. Yet a few writers, less fond of thunder, left footnotes like Cairns Alamet was a library before it was a ruin. Masyaf was a school before it was a rumor. Meanwhile, Ismaili communities endured, altered by time, anchored by patient devotion. Their scholars argued law and philosophy under rulers who preferred quiet to spectacle. Trade and learning moved them farther from the ridgetop myth and deeper into the steady middle of cities. Outsiders forgot the braid. Insiders kept the ethic. Small acts, fitted to necessity, rinsed of vanity. A blade remained one tool among many and rarely chosen. Consider a coastal town 2 generations after Acre. A ship from Alexandria arrived late and angry. Its captain accused a local broker of skimming cargo, and men gathered as if anger were a lantern. A magistrate, who kept a short letter from a mountain school among his papers because he liked the handwriting, walked between them and asked for lists, not oaths. He separated claim from face, then separated both from pride. He proposed that the disputed bales be opened in a courtyard under 3 lamps, counted by 3 guilds, with 3 mothers of large families watching the tally. The crowd laughed because the detail felt like a joke, then grew calm because it felt like fairness. By moonrise, the argument had dissolved into arithmetic. No one called it assassin work. They called it good sense that arrived on time. Elsewhere, a prince who had learned to hear with both ears grew old. He kept a habit from that thin paper season. Once a month he sat in a small room with 3 people who disagreed with him but liked his city more than they liked being right. They read petitions aloud until the room's temperature went down. He outlived rivals who preferred victories that sounded loud and cost heavy. In a border town, a baker became famous for asking 2 questions of every gossip: who profits, and what would change if we were tired. The questions spread. They made enemies lonely. The legend did its parallel work. Minstrels made the old man of the mountain wink from balconies built by ale. Painters perfected the hood. Centuries later, printers would tint the silhouette and sell the tint. Still later, screens would teach fingers to leap rooftops while history stayed on the ground. Unglamorous as always, letters, lamps, and the choreography of polite distances. The gap between picture and practice widened into comfort. Comfort makes sleep. Our story owes you sleep, but it owes you truth more. Truth says the perilous life never stopped being a minority's arithmetic. It says that when a community cannot win square fields, it wins corners. It trims ritual into thresholds, trims speech into letters that keep tempers from hiring knives, trims pride into policy that survives mornings. It prefers reversals you can pay back to victories no one can afford. It trains allies by teaching opponents to be competent. Its monuments are not arches. They are routines that outlive their authors. There were still blades. One winter in Anatolia, a provincial bully learned that a quiet threat can write straighter than a riot. One summer in the Jazeera, a hot sermon cooled under a single sentence delivered at the right ear. Not every story ended clean. Some bent into grief no ledger could fix. Manuals adapted. They warned young hands that the line between proportion and cruelty moves with hunger. They reminded older hands that weariness confuses thrift with coldness. When methods harden, purposes must soften. When purposes harden, methods must shrink. By the 14th century, a curious backflow began. Sunni and Christian courts, which had once cursed mountaincraft, absorbed its housekeeping until they forgot whom they'd learned it from. City laws mandated lit corridors to palaces, staggered audiences, gift protocols. oath formats that prevented hand-to-hand proximity. Merchants invented insurance for caravans. Whispers lost retail value. Fear found itself priced and taxed. The mask had conquered the stage. The method had conquered the floorboards. The last strong memory of the old heights lived in libraries. A monastic copyist, matching a Persian hand as best he could, paused over a line that said, "Leave no story behind that your purpose does not need." He wrote it again in the margin because it sounded like prayer. A jurist in Cairo, irritated by sloppy accusations, scribbled, "Call a crime what it is. Do not import mountains to flatter the guilty." A traveler admitted that the garden tales were delicious and wrong. Small lights, steady, scattered like winter constellations, enough to navigate by if you lifted your eyes. Which brings us to this room, this voice, this lamp. We have walked bazaars and ramparts, tents and chancellors. We have watched quiet letters save loud lives and small mistakes nearly spoil patient seasons. We have seen a word acquire a costume and a community keep a conscience. There is one turn left, to fold the map without creasing it, to let the silhouettes hang on their hooks, and to ask what remains when lamps are lowered and doors are latched. The answer is not a secret. It is a habit. It is a way to stand in rooms. Hold that thought. The final pages will return to the first one. A flame in a stone chamber. A footstep that does not echo. A promise that prefers proportion to noise. We will close our eyes with them and leave the blade asleep beside the ledger, where it always belonged. Return to the room where we began. A flame working modestly at the edge of darkness. A table with two objects set slightly apart, a dagger and a ledger. The blade reflects the lamp in a bright, dishonest triangle. The ledger drinks the light and gives it back as understanding. The perilous life lived between these, never mistaking one for the other. When steel was chosen, it was punctuation. When ink was chosen, it was grammar. Together they wrote a language that small communities use to survive large weather. Listen, night outside is not empty. It is crowded with choices that did not have to shout. A cook rinsing twice, a clerk counting straw, a guard adding a question and subtracting a flourish, a prince hearing with both ears, a messenger folding a thin page so neatly that a season walks inside it without tearing. None of these moments will fill romances. All of them add up to safety. All of them make dawn possible. We have watched daggers move like sentences that end arguments quickly and carefully. We have watched letters move like drafts that keep arguments from needing and ending at all. We have seen Alamet's stone, bow and Masyaf's lampsteady, and we have seen their practices dissolve into towns that do not remember who taught them. We have tracked the word assassin as it slipped its history and put on a mask, then sold tickets to its own performance. And we have followed the quieter record that refused costume, trade protected by tact, policy cooled by proportion, fear coaxed into being useful instead of sovereign. Take inventory before we sleep. Myth, a secret garden that manufactures devotion with illusions and indulgence. Record, apprenticeships measured in errands, oaths sized to a single breath, exits drilled before entries, habits so exact that accidents fail to multiply. Myth, killers drugged into obedience. Record, agents trained into steadiness, deployed with restraint, withdrawn as soon as purpose was served. Myth, a wizard of the mountain waving youths forward like props. Record, teachers, librarians, water engineers, and careful elders who wrote to rulers in a tone that saved both pride and lives. Take more inventory. Techniques that survived their origins, layered thresholds, rotated guards, gift protocols that keep fingers from crossing dangerous distances, letters that praise before they press, truces disguised as market timing, rumors guided like water, errors that kept the manuals humble, bows performed too elegantly, disguises that fit so perfectly they drew attention, courtesy that read like mockery to the wrong ear, corrections that endured, strip flourish sharpen empathy. Prefer a rumor that averts a blade to a blade that repairs a rumor. Now, let the silhouettes hang where they belong. This is not a call to romance danger. The perilous life cost. It put young shoulders under colder weather than their years deserved. It buried failures with a silence that saved others while wounding a few. It taught that minority is a geography and conscience, a tool that must fit in a pocket. It left us a stern kindness. Choose the smallest effective act. Pay for it in attention. Leave the room steadier than you found it. Imagine closing the ledger. Your hand rests on the cover. You can feel the weight of columns whose epics are written in olive oil and lamp hours, in tolls remitted and passwords rotated. The dagger remains on the table, asleep by design. If you are tempted to dramatize it, if you wish to carry it into the hall and let lamplight sketch a legend on the walls, remember the arithmetic you have learned. The blade is dear. Spend it last. Spend attention first. Spend patience always. Outside this room, the city you cannot see is already practicing what the mountains taught. Lamps burn at corners where arguments like to gather. An auctioneer checks for masks. A patrol rotates routes without telling its own feet why. A magistrate rewrites a notice one sentence shorter so pride can fit through the gate. None of these acts will be called by the mountain name. That is fine. Legacies are healthiest when they do not need credit. A good method prefers gratitude to applause, results to reputation. If you must keep a souvenir from these hours, let it be a way of standing. Stand where your voice can travel without raising itself. Stand where a letter can arrive at the right hand. Stand where a habit can replace a reaction. Stand where the smallest effective act can be seen by the right witnesses and by no one else. Then let the witnesses do the copying and let rumor do the distribution. It is not heroic. It is how mornings are purchased. At last, lower the wick. The room shrinks gently. The ledger warms beneath your palm. A small animal that has learned to breathe with you. Beyond the door, a footstep passes and does not echo. That is the final proof. Proportion has been kept. No one needs to run. Whether enemies call it intoxication or principle, whether poets paint it in hoods or scholars in footnotes, the craft has done what it came to do: nudge the world toward calmer thresholds. The knife stays at rest. The pages cool. Sleep comes down the corridor like a promise delivered on time. If your mind wanders as you drift toward bazaars and terraces, toward Tyre and Acre, toward a prince who learned to hear, toward a cook who saved a letter by rinsing twice, let it. Those are the right dreams. They do not chase, they shepherd, they do not threaten. They warn kindly. When morning finds you, the lamp will be a small ash. The room ordinary again, and the ledger ready to open where any careful day begins, with the smallest effective act.